It was a bright, warm Sunday afternoon. I was at home with my mother and daddy. And we got the news that Pearl Harbor had been bombed by the Japanese.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
So I knew that something was going to change drastically. I was 19 years old. I was a senior in high school, and I volunteered to join the Air Force, and I left and went to Kiesel Field, Mississippi, and sworn in there, and I stayed there but just a short time, and I got on a troop train, a lot of soldiers, and went to a radio operator school in Illinois. It was Shotfield, Illinois, and we stayed there for about 6 months. During that 6 months, I learned the International Morse code. That's the dots and dashes. Yeah. And when I finished school there, I went to a gunnery school in Las Vegas, Nevada, and it was it was a big, dusty place in the desert, and that's where I went to gunnery school. I learned to use all kind of gunnery weapons. When I finished that, I went to Biggs Air Force Base in El Paso, Texas, and started flying there. I was a radio operator on a B-24, and while I was there, I missed one of my flights that I was supposed to be on. I was filling out papers and taking some tests when my crew had a flying practice to do, and on that flight they crashed into a mountain there near El Paso. Most of the crew was killed, and except the radio operator. He was badly burned, wrapped all around the face, arms, hands. But I went to see him while he was in the hospital. Later, I went to Salt Lake City, Utah, in a so-called holding pattern, waiting to be reassigned to some other place, some other crew. I was then assigned to Pueblo, Colorado, and I joined a different crew there, and we continued to fly practice missions and practice radio work, and There was about 8 members of the crew: the pilot, the co-pilot, bombardier and navigator, of a flight engineer, and a radio operator. And then there was 3 gunners that practiced all the gunning and the shooting. And while we were there, and before we got ready to go overseas, we had been on a flight practicing everything. And before we got back to our air base, we crashed in the desert just outside of Pueblo, Colorado. I first looked out the window and I saw one of the engines fail. And then I looked out the window and another engine failed. And then another one failed. By this time we're getting close to the ground. And I thought, oh no, we're never going to make it. I sat down by the bulkhead it was a partition. Sit down, pulled my knees up like this, and I remember seeing, sitting a few feet from there was an ammunition box. It's about that wide, about that long, by that long. It had sharp edges and sharp corners, and I knew when we hit the ground that thing was going to come charging at me and it was going to kill me. That was a scary situation, but it only lasted 10 or 15 seconds, and hit the ground, bounced a couple of times, come to a stop just short of a huge, deep gully. We all walked away from that crash in Pueblo. We had a few cuts and bruises and bumps. One thing I remember specifically, right after the crash, everything went dusty. Great clouds of dust out there in the desert. And we all got so much dust on us, we could just barely see. I jumped out of the window back in the back, and so did some of the other men on the crew. One man had so much dust and dirt in his face and his eyes that he said he got to the window and we were all outside telling him to jump. And he said, I can't see. Jump anyway. And so he jumped. And actually he was only about 4 feet off the ground, but he couldn't tell how high he was. So after that, we continued our practice bombing missions out in the desert. We would go out there and there would always be some kind of target out there that we were supposed to go to, find it, and drop our practice bombs. They were just practice bombs, loaded probably with sand instead of anything that would explode. We finished our training there shortly after that, and we went overseas to England. We went overseas in the Queen Elizabeth. It was a big ship full of thousands of soldiers. We went to a place in England called Mendlesham. It was a little village out there in the country, surrounded by open countryside. and where people lived, where they grew their crops. It was a little village, but we had a very big air base there. And so at that time we changed, we had been reassigned to a B-17 airplane. That's the 4-engine airplane. You probably know what it looks like. Most people do. We had to get reacquainted with our airplane, what our position, where we sat, what we did, and get reacquainted with the kind of equipment we were supposed to be using on that airplane. It wasn't long until we started our bombing missions, and we would go out to our airplane early in the morning. That was in January of '44, and we practiced all of our that we could there. Then we were ready to go on our bombing missions. We flew 25 bombing missions over France, Germany, and one time over Czechoslovakia. We bombed targets like big railroad stations, ammunition storage places. We also bombed railroad bridges where they crossed major highways or major rivers. That was to keep the Germans from crossing the rivers and using the railroads to move their troops and equipment around. On most of our missions, we had a lot of flak to develop. Flak is when the big guns that the Germans had on the ground, they would shoot up to where we were, and then the thing would explode. And you're absolutely helpless. And you just stand there and look at it and pray that, man, I hope this doesn't hit me. And that was very frightening. A lot of times those explosions went everywhere. Sometimes they knocked some of our airplanes out of the air and they fell to the ground. And most of the men were always killed. Sometimes we could see, as a plane went down, we could see a few parachutes open. We knew then that a few men were able to jump out before they crashed, and therefore most of them became prisoners of war, except a few who were managed to hide and then be able to escape and get back to friendly lines in France or Germany. Like I said, the 25 missions were sometimes very scary. Our plane was hit once or twice, but only very minor damage. And then in May of 1945, the war ended there in Germany. And after the war ended, we flew 2 or 3 missions with loads of food and we airdropped the food down to a lot of people who had very little to eat during the war. And after we had dropped our food and so forth, we thought, hey, we've been over here bombing and fighting and bombing, but we've never set foot on the European continent, actually on the ground. So the pilot kind of thought a little bit, and he decided, why don't we develop some kind of imaginary engine trouble and we'll land over here. And so we did. We landed in Belgium somewhere. And we stayed there for maybe an hour or two, and then we took off and went back to England. So I did go over there on the ground, but only kind of for the fun of it after the war was over. We were eligible to come home in about 2 months. I believe it was in October when I got home in 1945. I stayed in the reserves so that I could, if I was ever called back to active duty in some other war, I could maintain my rank of tech sergeant. I have a picture of me during that time. That's how I looked when I was a young man. I don't look that well now. And of course, this was a certificate of honor that we got when we finished our 25 bombing missions that are listed here. During the Korean War, I was called back to active duty and assigned to an air base in Shreveport, Louisiana. By that time, several years had passed since World War II, and we were flying in a different airplane. This was the B-29. When I first walked out on the runway and I saw it, I thought, oh my, this thing is never going to fly. It didn't look like it had enough wing space. Or of course, it had much stronger engines, and it flew quite well. The Korean War was over within 1 year, and I never got overseas to do any combat flying during the Korean War. My only flying was as a radio operator during World War II in Germany. I'm glad you asked that question. You know what I'm going to say. I hope that all American young men and women nowadays, all of you have the courage and the willingness to fight for your country, always remembering how good it is to be living in a free country where you can come and go, work where you want to, quit when you get ready, do whatever you want to with your life. I would encourage you to stay with your education, study hard, learn your lesson. Whatever you learn you'll never forget. And it'll always be with you, and it will always be a source of encouragement, confidence in our future of America.